The cafe had its own rhythm, a steady hum of quiet conversations, clinking cups, and the soft hiss of the espresso machine that filled the air like a familiar song. Regulars came and went without much thought, each person wrapped in their own routine, their own small world. The staff moved with practiced ease, balancing trays, taking orders, offering polite smiles that felt natural and unforced. It was the kind of place where people felt comfortable, where time slowed just enough to let you breathe. But all of that changed the moment he stepped inside. The shift was immediate, almost invisible to someone who didn't know what to look for, but undeniable to anyone who had been there before. The door would open, and a subtle wave of tension would ripple through the room. Conversations would lower, not stop completely, but soften as if people suddenly became aware of every word they were saying. Laughter faded into polite smiles. Even the sounds of the cafe seemed to pull back, like the space itself was bracing for something unpleasant. The staff noticed it first, always. A quick glance exchanged between coworkers, a slight tightening of shoulders, a careful adjustment in posture. It wasn't fear in the loud, obvious sense. It was quieter than that, more controlled, like a habit formed over time. They knew what was coming, even if nothing had happened yet. Every movement became more deliberate. Orders were double-checked. Voices were measured. No one wanted to make a mistake. Not today, not with him here. The regular customers reacted in their own ways. Some kept their heads down, pretending to focus on their phones or their drinks, hoping to avoid any attention. Others watched quietly, their eyes following him for just a second too long before looking away. A few people exchanged knowing looks, small signals that said they understood exactly what kind of moment this was. It wasn't just about who he was, but what he brought with him every time he entered the cafe. A sense of unease that settled into the corners of the room and refused to leave. He didn't have to say anything at first. His presence alone was enough. The way he walked in, slow and confident, as if the space belonged to him, as if everyone else was just passing through something that was rightfully his. He never looked around with curiosity or warmth. His gaze moved over people like they were objects, like they didn't quite deserve his attention unless they were serving him directly. The staff knew the routine well. One of them would step forward, usually the one who had dealt with him the least recently, because no one wanted to be the familiar face he recognized. There was a careful politeness in every word, a controlled tone that tried to avoid setting him off in any way. It wasn't genuine friendliness. It was survival, shaped by past experiences that had taught them exactly how little it took for things to go wrong. Even the smallest delay, the slightest misunderstanding, could turn into something uncomfortable, something that lingered long after he left. The other customers felt it too, even if they had never spoken to him directly. They had seen enough. A sharp comment here, an unnecessary complaint there, the kind of behavior that made the room feel smaller, tighter, harder to relax in. It created an unspoken rule that everyone followed without discussing it. Stay out of his way. Don't get involved. Let it pass. The cafe, which usually felt open and welcoming, suddenly seemed divided into quiet zones of caution. People adjusted their behavior without thinking, lowering their voices, avoiding eye contact, keeping their distance. It was a shared understanding that spread through the room, connecting strangers in a silent agreement. No one challenged it. No one questioned it out loud. Because it had always been this way when he arrived, and over time, it had become normal in the most uncomfortable sense of the word. Everyone who worked at the cafe had a story about him, even if they tried not to talk about it too often. It wasn't just one bad moment or a single outburst that defined him. It was a pattern, something that repeated itself often enough that people stopped being surprised and started preparing for it instead. From the moment he sat down, there was an unspoken expectation that something would go wrong, not because of the service, but because of how he chose to respond to it. He didn't need a real reason. Sometimes it was as small as the temperature of his coffee, sometimes the timing of an order, and sometimes nothing at all except a mood that no one else could predict. The staff had learned to read the signs, the slight shift in his expression, the way his fingers tapped against the table, the sharp look he gave when something didn't meet his standards, even if those standards had never been clearly stated. His words carried a tone that cut deeper than the actual complaints. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. Like every sentence was designed to remind the person in front of him that they were beneath him, that their effort didn't matter, that their role was to serve and nothing more. A simple request could turn into a criticism, and a small mistake could turn into a public scene. He didn't lower his voice when he spoke. In fact, it often felt like he raised it just enough for others to hear, as if the attention was part of the point. The cafe would go quiet in those moments, not completely silent, but still enough that his words carried across tables, reaching people who wished they hadn't heard them at all. The staff stood there, forced to absorb it, to respond with politeness even when it wasn't returned. They apologized for things that didn't deserve apologies, fixed problems that had been exaggerated, and thanked him for his patience even when he showed none. It was exhausting in a way that went beyond the physical work. It weighed on them, building up over time, each interaction adding to the last. Some of the newer employees struggled the most. They weren't used to it yet, didn't know how to hide their reactions quickly enough. A flicker of confusion, a moment of hesitation, and he would notice. He always noticed. And when he did, it only gave him more reason to push further, to question their competence, to make them feel like they didn't belong there. The experienced staff would step in when they could, trying to smooth things over. But even that came with its own risk. Getting involved sometimes meant drawing his attention, and once you had it, it was hard to shake. It didn't matter how professional you were or how careful you tried to be. He found something to criticize, something to turn into an issue. Customers who had witnessed it before knew what to expect. They had seen servers walk away with forced smiles, only to release a quiet sigh once they were out of sight. They had watched drinks get sent back for reasons that didn't quite make sense, meals picked apart not because they were wrong, but because he needed them to be. It created a kind of tension that lingered long after the moment had passed. Conversations at nearby tables would slow, people choosing their words more carefully, as if the discomfort could spread if they weren't cautious. Some customers avoided coming in during the times he was known to appear. Others stayed, but kept their distance, not wanting to be close enough to become part of the situation. It wasn't just about the direct interactions. It was the way he changed the environment around him, turning a simple cafe visit into something people had to endure rather than enjoy. The staff carried that weight with them throughout their shifts, knowing that at any moment, they might be the next person standing in front of him, trying to manage a situation that was never really under their control, holding onto their composure while being treated in a way no one deserved, repeating the same polite responses, the same careful tone, hoping each time that it wouldn't escalate further, knowing deep down that it probably would. She wasn't like the others, at least not in the way the cafe had come to expect from someone new. On her first day, there was no sign of nervous energy spilling into her movements, no rushed steps or overly careful gestures that usually marked a beginner trying not to make mistakes. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet steadiness, the kind that didn't need to prove anything to be noticed. It showed in the way she moved between tables, in the way she listened when customers spoke, giving them her full attention without looking distracted or overwhelmed. There was a calm confidence in her posture, not loud or attention-seeking, but grounded, as if she trusted herself to handle whatever came her way. The other staff picked up on it quickly. They watched her during the slower moments, noticing how naturally she settled into the rhythm of the place. She didn't rush to fill silence with unnecessary chatter, but she wasn't distant either. When she spoke, her voice was even, respectful, and clear, not rehearsed or overly cautious. It felt genuine, which was something that couldn't be trained overnight. There was also something else, something harder to define but impossible to ignore. She didn't seem weighed down by the same tension that hovered over everyone else, the quiet anticipation that shaped how they moved and spoke, especially on days when certain customers were expected. It wasn't that she was unaware. She noticed things, the exchanged glances, the subtle shifts in behavior, the way conversations dipped when certain topics came up. But instead of absorbing that tension, she seemed to stand slightly apart from it, as if she hadn't accepted it as part of her reality. During her first few interactions with customers, she handled everything with a level of composure that stood out. Even when faced with minor complaints or impatience, she didn't rush to apologize in a way that diminished her own role. She acknowledged concerns, responded thoughtfully, and maintained a sense of balance that was easy to respect. It wasn't defensive and it wasn't submissive. It was steady. The kind of steadiness that didn't invite conflict but also didn't leave room for disrespect to grow unchecked. Some of the more experienced staff tried to give her subtle advice, small warnings wrapped in casual conversation. They mentioned certain regulars, hinted at situations she might encounter, spoke in a tone that suggested she should be careful without saying exactly why. She listened, nodding politely, taking in what they said without interrupting. But there was no visible shift in her demeanor afterward. No added tension in her shoulders, no change in the way she approached her work. If anything, she seemed even more grounded, as if the information had settled into her understanding without shaking her confidence. Customers noticed her too, especially those who came in often enough to recognize new faces. There was a quiet curiosity in the way they watched her, wondering how long that calm would last, whether it would fade like it had for others or hold its place against the environment that had shaped everyone else. Some found themselves relaxing a little more around her, responding to the ease she brought into each interaction. It reminded them of what the cafe used to feel like before tension became part of its atmosphere. She didn't try to stand out, didn't seek attention or approval, but there was something about her presence that shifted the energy of the space in small, almost unnoticeable ways. Conversations at her tables flowed a bit more naturally. People lingered a little longer, not out of obligation, but because the moment felt lighter. The staff, even those who had grown used to keeping their guard up, found brief moments where they could breathe a little easier when working alongside her. It wasn't a complete change, not enough to erase the patterns that had already been set, but it was there, subtle and real. She carried herself with a sense of self-respect that didn't need to be announced. It showed in the way she met people's eyes when they spoke to her, not in a confrontational way, but with quiet assurance. She didn't shrink her presence to make others more comfortable, and she didn't overcompensate to prove her worth. She simply existed in the role, fully and unapologetically, as if she understood something that others had slowly forgotten. That respect wasn't something you begged for or avoided losing, but something you held on to, even in spaces where it wasn't always given freely. Moving through her shift with the same calm rhythm, unaware or unconcerned with the expectations placed around her, carrying that quiet confidence into every interaction, every step, every moment that would soon be tested in ways no one else in the cafe could ignore. No one noticed the exact moment it began, only that something felt different in the air. The cafe was already carrying its usual tension, the kind that settled in whenever he was present, but this time it didn't stay contained in quiet glances and lowered voices. It surfaced. He had been sitting at his usual table, posture relaxed in a way that suggested ownership rather than comfort, his attention fixed on the smallest details as if searching for something to challenge. When his order arrived, the exchange started like it always did, with a look, a pause just long enough to signal dissatisfaction before a single word was spoken. The waitress stood across from him, holding her place without shifting her weight, her expression composed, attentive but not overly eager. He spoke, his tone sharp, questioning something that didn't seem to require questioning. It was a familiar pattern, one the staff had seen many times before. A minor issue turned into a pointed remark, the kind meant to put the other person on edge. A few customers nearby glanced over, already expecting the scene to follow its usual course. But it didn't. She listened without interrupting, her face calm, her posture steady, giving him the space to finish without reacting too quickly. That alone was different. Most people rushed to respond, trying to fix things before they escalated, but she didn't. When she did speak, her voice was clear and even, not defensive, not apologetic in the way he was used to. She addressed what he said directly, acknowledging the concern without accepting the tone behind it. It was subtle, but it shifted something. He paused, just for a second, as if recalibrating. Then he pushed again, this time a little harder, his words carrying more edge, testing whether she would fold like the others. The cafe grew quieter, the background noise dipping as more people became aware of what was happening. Staff members exchanged quick looks, the kind that asked whether someone should step in, whether this was about to turn into something bigger. But no one moved. There was something in the way she stood there that held the moment in place. She didn't raise her voice, didn't match his tone, but she didn't retreat either. Her response came again, measured and firm, choosing her words carefully but without hesitation. She corrected him where he was wrong, clarified what needed to be clarified, and did it in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. It wasn't disrespectful, but it wasn't submissive. It was balanced in a way that felt unfamiliar in that space. He wasn't used to that. His expression shifted, the confidence in it tightening into something sharper, less controlled. He leaned forward slightly, his presence more forceful now, as if trying to reassert the dynamic he was used to. His voice rose just enough to carry further, to draw attention, to remind everyone of who he was. But the effect wasn't the same this time. Instead of shrinking the space around him, it seemed to highlight the contrast between them. The more he pushed, the more her steadiness stood out. She held eye contact, not as a challenge, but as a statement that she wasn't going to be talked down to. Her hands remained still, her posture unchanged, her focus clear. She wasn't trying to win an argument. She was setting a boundary. That was what made it different. The customers who had been watching felt it before they could explain it. A shift, subtle but undeniable. The tension that usually bent in his favor didn't quite land the same way. It hovered, uncertain, as if waiting to see which direction it would fall. Even the staff seemed caught between instinct and curiosity, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch it unfold. He spoke again, but there was something missing now, something that had always been there before. The certainty, the control. His words didn't carry the same weight when they weren't being absorbed in silence or met with nervous agreement. Instead, they met resistance, not loud or aggressive, but steady and unyielding. She responded one more time, her voice as calm as it had been from the beginning, her words leaving no space for him to twist or dismiss them. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it, clear, grounded, and firm enough that it couldn't be brushed aside, standing there in front of him without stepping back, without lowering herself to make the moment easier for him, holding that line in a way no one else had before while the entire cafe watched, realizing they were witnessing something they had never seen happen in that space, something that broke the pattern they had all come to expect, something that refused to follow the script that had always played out the same way until now. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire cafe had been paused, held in a quiet suspension where people were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. The usual rhythm didn't return right away. Cups sat untouched, conversations left hanging mid-thought, and even the soft background noise seemed slower to come back, like the space itself needed time to adjust. The shift wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it. The customers were the first to show it, though not in obvious ways. A few exchanged glances that carried more meaning than words, small, almost hesitant acknowledgments that what had just happened wasn't ordinary. Some leaned back in their chairs, their expressions thoughtful, as if replaying the moment in their minds to make sure they hadn't imagined it. Others looked toward the table where it had all unfolded, not with the usual discomfort, but with a kind of quiet respect that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about the confrontation itself. It was about how it had been handled, the calm steadiness that had replaced the tension they had grown used to. The staff felt it differently, but just as strongly. For them, it wasn't just a surprising moment. It was something deeper, something that touched the part of their routine they had stopped questioning. They had spent so long adapting, adjusting their behavior to avoid conflict, that seeing someone stand firm without fear disrupted that pattern in a way that was hard to ignore. A few of them stood a little straighter without realizing it, their shoulders less tense than before. Others exchanged quick looks that held a mix of relief and disbelief, as if they were silently asking each other if things could really be different. No one said it out loud, but the thought was there, moving quietly between them. Even those who had been ready to step in earlier now held back, not out of hesitation, but because the situation no longer felt like something that needed rescuing. It had resolved itself in a way they hadn't thought possible. The millionaire remained at his table, but the presence he carried didn't fill the room the way it had before. There was a subtle change in how people responded to him, not open defiance, not confrontation, but a lack of the usual retreat. Customers didn't rush to look away as quickly. The staff moved around the cafe with a bit more ease, their focus returning to their work instead of orbiting around him. It wasn't a complete transformation, not something that erased everything that had come before, but it was enough to be noticed, enough to matter. The tension that had once centered around him seemed to loosen its grip, no longer dictating the entire atmosphere of the space. Conversations slowly picked up again, but they carried a different tone now. There was a lightness, a subtle shift in energy that hadn't been there earlier. People spoke a little more freely, laughed a little more naturally, as if the weight that had been pressing down on the room had been lifted, even if only slightly. Some customers stole occasional glances toward the waitress, their expressions soft with appreciation, though no one made a scene of it. It didn't need to be acknowledged out loud to be understood. The moment had already spoken for itself. The staff returned to their tasks, but their movements were less guarded, less shaped by anticipation. There was still work to be done, orders to take, tables to clear, but the underlying tension that usually accompanied it had eased. It showed in small ways, in the way they spoke to each other, in the way they carried themselves, in the absence of that constant, quiet alertness that had once defined their shifts. The cafe, which had felt divided just moments before, began to feel whole again, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to remind everyone of what it was supposed to be. And at the center of it all, the shift in power lingered, not as a loud declaration, but as a quiet understanding shared by everyone who had been there, something that stayed in the air, shaping the space in ways that didn't need to be explained, something that would be remembered long after the moment itself had passed, carried in the way people looked at each other, in the way they moved through the cafe, in the subtle but undeniable realization that the balance had changed, even if just for that day, even if just enough to show that it could. What stayed with people after that day wasn't just the moment itself, but what it revealed about something they had slowly stopped thinking about. For a long time, the cafe had operated under an unspoken rule that some behavior had to be tolerated, that certain people could cross lines without consequence, and that the best way to handle it was to endure and move on. It wasn't a rule anyone had written down or openly agreed to, but it had shaped how everyone acted. It showed up in the way staff softened their voices, in the way customers avoided getting involved, in the way discomfort was quietly accepted as part of the experience. Over time, that acceptance had settled in so deeply that it felt normal, even when it shouldn't have. What changed that day wasn't loud or forceful, but it was clear enough to challenge that idea. It showed that respect didn't have to disappear just because someone else chose to ignore it. It showed that staying calm didn't mean staying silent, and that standing your ground didn't require anger or aggression. The waitress hadn't raised her voice or created a scene, but she also hadn't allowed herself to be diminished. That balance was what made it powerful. It wasn't about proving someone wrong for the sake of winning. It was about holding on to a sense of dignity in a situation where it would have been easier to let it go. For the staff, the lesson settled in gradually. At first, it was just a memory of something unexpected, something that broke the routine they had grown used to. But as they moved through their shifts in the days that followed, it began to take on more meaning. They found themselves thinking back to that moment in small, quiet ways, in how they responded to difficult customers, in how they carried themselves during tense interactions, in how they viewed their own role in those situations. It didn't turn everything upside down overnight, but it created a shift in perspective. The idea that they had to accept disrespect without question didn't feel as fixed as it once had. There was space now, however small, to approach things differently. Customers felt it too. though their takeaway came from a different place. Many of them had spent time in that cafe watching uncomfortable moments unfold, choosing not to intervene, convincing themselves it wasn't their place. That day challenged that thinking. It reminded them that silence, even when it feels easier, can contribute to the very atmosphere they wish would change. Some began to pay more attention, not in a passive way, but with a sense of awareness that hadn't been there before. They noticed how people were treated, how situations were handled, and in some cases, they responded in small but meaningful ways, offering support through a kind word, a patient attitude, or simply by not looking away. The lesson wasn't about confrontation for its own sake. It was about recognizing the value of respect, both for yourself and for others, and understanding that it doesn't have to be sacrificed to keep the peace. It showed that courage doesn't always look dramatic or loud. Sometimes it looks like staying steady when someone expects you to bend, like choosing not to shrink when the situation pressures you to. It also highlighted how one moment, one decision, can influence more than just the people directly involved. The ripple effect moved through the cafe in ways that weren't immediately obvious, shaping attitudes, shifting expectations, and creating a new sense of what was possible. It didn't erase every difficult interaction or change every outcome, but it planted something that hadn't been there before. A reminder that respect is not something reserved for a few, but something that belongs to everyone in the room. Something that can be protected without raising your voice. Something that grows stronger when it is quietly but firmly upheld. Something that doesn't need permission to exist, even in places where it has been ignored for far too long.